Hello, everyone. I just wanted to quickly introduce myself. My name is Jerome Comeau. I use he, him, or they, them pronouns, and I live in Portland and various other online locations with my partner, our 3 dogs, and our 2 cats. I have been working in the IT industry in one capacity or another since I was 19, which means I've spent more than half my life working in operations. I was a member of the Communication Workers of America Local 6327 when I worked for a now merged into oblivion telecom company. I currently work as a senior manager for a moderately sized IT consultancy firm where I lead a team that supports multiple 24/7 production environments. As a part of the management organization, please trust me when I say that unions are essential to worker health and well-being in the coming months and years. I sit before you advocating something that I cannot participate in. I still think it's important enough that I'm going to talk at you for another 20 minutes. Unions. What are they? Why do you want one? And what do you need to do and avoid doing to get one? I got interested in unions early. My father spent his entire working life, and therefore most of my life, as a union organizer and labor representative for several different unions in a variety of workspaces, eventually retiring from his job at the Internal Revenue Service and the position of Midwest Regional Lead Negotiator for the National Treasury Employees Union. My father had many jobs, but his career was in organizing. That commitment to labor only managed to really sink in once I was much older, but it has finally sunk in. So here I am, talking to you about unions, specifically unions in the tech space. At the core of it, this talk boils down to basically one thing, which is a message that has been carried down since Euripides through the ages to now. In the end, all we ever have is each other. Our culture and our society have evolved to separate and alienate us from each other, the better to exploit and control us. The only weapon we have to fight back is banding together and taking collective action to force a reevaluation of our labor. To quote the Hades Tigers baseball team, and if you don't know what baseball is, do yourself a favor and go watch Aaron Aldrich's talk about it. We are many stripes, but we are one tiger. What is a union? Well, basically, it's when you get tired of being faffed about by your employer and band together with other workers to fix the problem. Unions are a type of collective action where the people who work and the people who ask for that work try to find a better balance. A union is a piece of technology. That is, it is a tool that requires maintenance to perform its intended job, like a hammer or an axe or a Java program. It amplifies your voice by joining it with others who are asking for the same things and helps to foster a peer-to-peer relationship between workers and employers. I know that sounds a little bit abstract, so let me try another metaphor. Everyone has had the experience of a C-level executive dropping a metaphorical glitter bomb into the center of your deployment at the last moment, totally borking your timeline, rollout, and all of the design work you've done. And in ops, that usually means you're stuck in a weekend-long deploy, roll, break, rollback loop. Or on the other hand, you have to try and explain to someone who could fire you without notice that you cannot, in fact, break the laws of physics. So what do you need right then? Well, friends, do I have the tool for you? A union is an off-the-shelf, customizable, subscription model, federated service framework with a standardized API protocol that streamlines interactions between the worker and the employer, including financial transactions, reviews, incident investigations, and termination, graceful or catastrophic. It also exists to expose information and interactions to other workers within the service. It's designed to iterate through various mechanisms to be eventually consistent for all users, not identical, but consistent, and acts as a check against unscoped changes in SLIs or KPIs between employers and employees. You are probably familiar with union as a term from either set theory or SQL, depending on your background. Those are usually what we're dealing with in tech. But in this case, we're talking about the concept of a trade association, a continuous association of wage earners for the purpose of maintaining or improving the conditions of their employment. from Sidney and Beatrice Webb in their History of Trade Unionism, published in 1894. Modern unions are possibly one of the first open source technologies to exist in the industrial world. Workers in factories and on the docks wrestled control of their lives inch by bloody inch from the owners by banding together, sharing ideas, and iterating on processes and procedures to ensure the maximum value for their work. Leveraging the work of Karl Marx in his Das Kapital, published in 1867, the idea of communal organization comes into the mainstream as an explicit alternative to capitalism. It was on this foundation that unions in the modern sense were born around the turn of the 20th century. In 1889, the London Dock Strike gives birth to the UK's Labour Party. At around that same time in the United States, unions spearheaded by the American Federation of Labor, the precursor to the modern AFL-CIO, began organizing groups including clothing makers, coal miners, and railroad employees. The big motivators of those three groups was to keep their employers from actively killing them, mostly by demanding workplace safety measures. However, just as the rise of unions in the Western world was gaining traction, World War I threw many industries into a war footing, and organizing was discouraged to support the troops. Then in 1917, communist forces overthrew Tsarist Russia, and the capitalist countries became aware of the actual threat of collective action. Today, union membership in the United States sits at around 11%. Compared with France at 15%, Great Britain at 24%, and Finland at 70%. These percentages are unevenly distributed across the workforce, with the majority of these union jobs being in the labor sector, that is, Teamsters, construction, longshoremen, transit drivers, and the aforementioned railroad and mining workers. But the fastest growing union in the United States today is, in fact, the Service Employees International Union, the SEIU, which spans healthcare workers, cafeteria and service workers, and the like. And the SEIU has been making inroads into the IT industry, especially around healthcare. The SEIU now represents about 5,000 IT workers, almost all of them in healthcare environments, and has been working to bring more tech positions into the fold. Game Workers Unite is an international union that is making inroads in the tech industry through games. The GWU in Great Britain is part of the Independent Workers Union, or the IWGB, a relatively new union formed in 2012 that has been focused on organizing so-called gig workers. With the pandemic over the last 18 months, a lot of IT workers and IT-adjacent workers have found significant value in some of the benefits, like the ability to opt out of activities that might increase the risk of COVID exposure, that should in fact be standard, but that are being reduced or eliminated for the purposes of worker inspiration, by which they actually mean worker control. Consequently, talk of unions in IT has heated up significantly. For instance, the New Yorker magazine union explicitly included IT and office workers in their union and in the union negotiations, making it one of the first media shops that is unionized across all departments. So this is all well and good, but you and I are probably pretty well compensated for the amount of work we do. Why would we want to risk that by inciting discord and adversarial feelings in the workplace? Well, aside from the fact that 77% of people aged 18 to 34 are in favor of unions, including roughly 60% of new workers in IT, that is, workers with 0 to 3 years of experience, and aside from the fact that at-will employment is the de facto law in all 50 states at this point, and aside from the fact that people of color, queer folk, people over 50, and disabled people are all much more likely to be overworked and underpaid in every sector, but especially in IT, and aside from the fact that ProPublica and the Urban Institute produced a study that the likelihood of forced retirement, where you want to work but cannot find a job, affects up to 20% of the workforce over 50, aside from all that, just in the name of self-interest, Union positions are between 10 and 30% better compensated, both in pay and benefits, than comparable non-union jobs. From a purely mercenary perspective, being in a union can reduce stress around layoffs, healthcare, holidays, and PTO, even if nothing about salaries change. And please note that being in a union does not mean the principal engineer and the associate analyst get paid the same. What it means is that these two principal engineers are compensated in a fair and consistent way, and the steps from associate to principal are clear, understood, and monitored for bias. From a middle management perspective, unions are great because they solve about 50% of the current manager workload, which is determining goals, milestones, and fairness within the team by explicitly codifying and measuring towards them independent of any personal relationships. In addition, unions can be exceptionally helpful when it comes to staffing properly and bringing all co-rotations under control. Corporations may not like unions, but many managers do like them and would often like to be a part of them. So how exactly does one get started forming or joining a union? Well, before you get started, it is important to understand capitalist systems exert enormous pressure to prevent or destroy collective action. If you work for a company that makes money in the world today, that company has a vested interest in keeping your wages as low as possible, your benefits as meager as possible, and your person isolated from information about other workers like you. Many companies will actively discourage employees and prospective employees from sharing compensation packages, despite this practice being against federal law. Organizing is a big job, and it is slow and hard and sometimes disappointing. It is still worth doing. And remember, you're not doing it alone. First, before anything else, the thing that you want to do is have several private conversations with your coworkers about the idea of a union and forming a union. Do not do this using company resources. No Slack, no email, no office hours discussions. The pandemic makes it much harder to do in-person meetings like off-site lunches or grill parties or the like, but still, don't use company resources. Y'all are nerds, so what you should do is set up an IRC chat, or at the very least some sort of Discord. If you must use Slack, create your own project, and most importantly, do not mention the company as part of that project. That way it can't be seized as company property. Don't use your company's Zoom login for conference calls either. Again, you don't want anyone to be able to claim you were organizing using company resources or on company time. Note, it is not just developers or operations people who might be interested in a union. Make time to talk with folk who work with you but not in your department. Accounting, recruiting, marketing, client management, all of those people also work at your company and share your benefits package. It's not just your crappy health insurance and weird PTO. Second, once you have a small group of people who are committed to forming a union, figure out which umbrella organization best suits your needs. You can form your own union, many committees out there do, but working with a bigger org lets you leverage their expertise, history, and sometimes even their resources. For IT tech workers, there have been successful partnerships with the IWW, the International Workers of the World, the SEIU, and the CWA, or Communications Workers of America, with smaller coalitions like the Workers Collective branching off recently. Getting these organizations involved early helps with forming, driving, and sustaining the work of unionizing. Third, form a steering committee. The steering committee exists to A, communicate with workers around complaints and demands, B, correlate and clarify those items as necessary, and C, act as an intermediary between the employer and the union to be. The steering committee will then work with the potential members and the umbrella organization to put together a list of negotiating positions, and with member input, carefully rank those positions. Eventually, the union will want to hold elections for committee positions, but until then, the members must remember that no one voice is more important than another. Becoming a union is a collective action. Fourth, After the steering committee has a good idea of who wants a union and what the demands of that union will be, the next step is to have a card campaign. Get a majority of your coworkers to sign a document proving their willingness to allow a union, also known as a union authorization card. An important note here. Anti-union forces will often say that you are giving up rights by signing a card. That is not true. You are not joining a union when you sign a card. You are not part of a union until there has been a successful contract negotiation and you have agreed to pay dues to be represented under that contract. The card drive is the mechanism by which a union convinces the National Labor Relations Board that a union is wanted and is a going concern. The good news is this no longer has to be an actual piece of paper. Online forms are considered valid by the NLRB, so it's just a matter of getting a majority of the possible members to say, yes, I'd like to be able to join a union. Once enough of these cards are collected, the steering committee then petitions the NLRB for recognition. Recognition is hardly ever denied, but sometimes the NLRB will take more time or ask for more information. Do not lose hope. Fifth, form a union, declare the intent to organize and negotiate, and ask your employer to recognize your union. All of the hard work of organizing to this point is joined by the hard work of negotiations and tactics. Wresting concessions from employers is harder than everything that has come before, but you and your fellow workers have the power. Getting voluntarily recognized as a union can happen, but it's rare. Usually some sort of collective action needs to take place before the employer comes to the table to negotiate. Collective action isn't just a strike. There are many activities that the collective body can do that would be impossible for a lone worker to execute safely. Speaking to the press, speaking to competitors in the workspace, and speaking or meeting or trying to meet with executives or officers of the government representatives are just a few that come to mind. Even if you have a spokesperson, even if you are a spokesperson, it is always better to have as many people as possible present to take up space with you when you are doing something. You are not alone. Don't let anyone separate you from your fellow workers. Take heart. The union starts with you. As I wrap up, I mentioned at the start of this that my father was a labor organizer for the better part of 50 years. Over the years, he gave me a number of items to remember about organizing. I call them the Thomas Manning Comeau principles of organization. My dad spent a lot of time with the Teamsters, so his union organizing was often more rough and tumble than the modern boardroom, but most of it still applies. Here they are. Rule 0. It never hurts to be good at your job. The better you are at the work that you're doing, the harder it is for management to make an example of you. It is not impossible. You can still get fired for organizing, but it's a lot more difficult if it turns out that you're really good at what you do. Rule 1. Human resource does not work for you. Human resources, people management, whatever the euphemism, these are organizations that keep the company from getting sued. Their job is to keep the company safe legally. Sometimes that means enforcing rules. Sometimes that means making other things go away. They do not work for you. They work for the company. The company thinks of you as a resource to be extracted, not a person to be protective. That's capitalism. The only organization that works for you is your union. Rule 2, write down everything between you and your employer. The moment that companies finds out, the moment a company finds out people are working to organize, they become extremely resistant to any activity of that sort. Before you get to that point, make sure you have written documentation about your performance, and every time after that point, update that written documentation. Every phone call, every email, every hallway conversation or conference call or drive-by, write it down in pen, on paper, with a time and date. Keep a journal. If something retaliatory happens, you want a record of what did or didn't happen. Rule 3, never write down anything about your organizing. Don't send emails or text messages or make phone calls on company time or using company resources. That's an explicit, terminable offense. Recognize that any records you keep around organizing will become evidence if legal action is taken on either side. So, don't record anything you wouldn't want to read at the request of opposing counsel. My father used to say, if you must write something down, write it in pencil, on paper, and burn it afterwards. I think that's a little much for the modern union organizer, but it doesn't hurt to keep as a guideline in your head. Rule 4, do not expect to be protected even if you're right. Laws will often be on the side of the worker. The problem with that is a law is only enforceable if someone chooses to enforce it. And even if someone chooses to enforce it, the recompense is usually a fine of some sort. And a fine is a price. And most companies are happy to pay the price for the status quo. You can be demonstrably correct in what you are doing and still get hosed. Rule 5, don't become an expert in labor history. I mean, if you want to become an expert in labor history, you should by all means do that. Labor history is fascinating, and there are eye-popping numbers of things where you are reading the book and you just think, they did what? That having been said, expertise around legal action or union organizing or all of that, it probably needs to come from professionals anyway. So unless you want to become a lawyer or a labor expert, that's not the best use of your time. Don't be afraid to ask for help. You can reach out to people around you and people with you and people in organizations with you. You burning out doesn't help anyone. Rule 6, do become an expert in Robert's Rules of Order. The modern experience of labor organizing is by and large a bureaucratic process. And that means the most useful methodology for controlling a bureaucracy is, in fact, Robert's Rules of Order. A lot of the current unions out there already use it. Often it is a mechanism by which organizing committees work with employers to discuss contract negotiations. And it's just relatively handy to have in your back pocket as the thing that will let you talk to and help things happen or not happen as you want. Rule 7. Anger is for the boss, not your fellow workers. Some workers will not be interested in unionizing, and that's got to be okay. The goal is better work lives for everyone, not just the people who agree with you. Non-union workers are the opposition. The company is the enemy. Rule 8. Collective organization is collective. You are not alone. Changing the world for the better is never easy, but it is always worthwhile. Let us hold hands that we may pull each other to safety. Good luck.